Thank you so much for that introduction, Kerry. It's too bad it's been such a slow news summer for the White House. Nothing to talk about here. It's just a real privilege to be joined today by three extraordinary public servants, Mack McLarty, Andrew Card, and Denis McDonough. I just want to give you just a few brief excerpts from their lengthy biographies. As Bill Clinton's first White House Chief of Staff, Thomas F. Mack McLarty helped enact the historic 1993 Deficit Reduction Package, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Family and Medical Leave Law, and landmark welfare reform legislation, among many other things. As George W. Bush's first chief, Andy Card served 5 years and 3 months, setting the longevity record for chiefs in the modern era. On the morning of September 11, 2001, it was Card who whispered in George W. Bush's ear that America was under attack. As Barack Obama's final chief from February 2013 until January 20, 2017, Denis McDonough provided strategic advice to the president on the most significant domestic policy, national security, and management issues facing the federal government. He enforced plans and accountability for performance and goals, maintaining the Obama administration's reputation for effective, ethical operations. But let me tell you, this isn't the half of it. As I learned from talking to all 17 living White House chiefs for my book, The Gatekeepers, these are the men who make the difference between success and disaster for every presidency. You know, a reviewer of The Gatekeepers pointed out, quote, "The media obsessively scrutinizes the records of key presidential appointees, including cabinet secretaries, Supreme Court justices, and ambassadors, yet ironically, the appointment most critical to the success of the presidency, the chief of staff, requires no Senate confirmation and receives little public scrutiny." Well, you know, that's true. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution about a White House chief. They're unelected and unconfirmed, hired and fired by the president alone. And yet, as James A. Baker III told me, the White House Chief of Staff is the second most powerful job in government. Dick Cheney, who ought to know, says the White House Chief of Staff has more power than the Vice President. Some might say that's true, except when Cheney was Vice President. But Andy may have something to say about that. The truth is, in all seriousness, that every president learns, often the hard way, that he cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House Chief of Staff as first among equals in the White House, and to execute his agenda, and perhaps most important, to tell him what he does not want to hear. I'd like to play a clip from our documentary, The President's Gatekeepers, just to give you an idea of how relentless the job can be. We play that first clip.
He is the president's most powerful advisor and closest confidant. The White House Chief of Staff is the person the president turns to transform his agenda into reality. And when big decisions change the course of history, the Chief of Staff is often the only other person in the room.
Being the White House Chief of Staff was unquestionably the toughest job I ever had.
It's brutal on you. It's brutal on your family. Nothing ever comes easy. And it is constant.
You gotta kind of get up pretty early to beat the president to the punch here, that's for sure.
The average day for me would start at 5:30 in the morning.
I get up at 5.
4:30, 5 in the morning. Read 5 newspapers as quickly as I could to get a feel for what was going on in the world. Go to the White House.
We've got lots to cover today.
I'd meet with the CIA briefer. Then you'd meet with the foreign policy team, the economic policy team. Then you'd meet with the White House staff. Then you'd have a larger meeting to talk about what you were going to try to get accomplished that particular day. In an average day, you would deal with things like Bosnia, Northern Ireland, the budget, taxation, the environment, then you'd have lunch.
You have a lunch probably with the vice president, your announcement of policy or whatever you're doing that day.
Get to work.
You go on, running from the president's office down to the national security briefing on any one foreign policy issues or questions. You gotta get a lot of work done. There's bipartisan meetings that you'll have over at the Hill.
We have to have the meeting today.
You're meeting with the staff, you're returning phone calls, trying to get something done on behalf of the president. Is there anything breaking on the news? Is there a call the president or you have to make to a senator or a House member to move something? So while you're in a meeting with the president, the left side of your brain is usually operating on what's going on in the Hill or in the press. Somewhere around 6:30, you have a wrap up with the president. He goes home and has dinner. You finish up around 7:30 in the office.
We checked the staff secretary's office one last time.
You go home and you're on the phone on the way home, on the phone during dinner, on the phone while you're reading to your kids to sleep, and you fall asleep before the book ends. And you're woken up at night around 1 in the morning with probably something bad happening around the world.
So let's talk for a minute about what it is that the White House chief actually does. Andy, why don't you tell us a little bit about he's famously the gatekeeper. Why is that important, and what does that mean?
The best way to describe the responsibility of a chief of staff is to plagiarize. Actually, it's no longer plagiarism because I'm giving him credit, but Professor Roger B. Porter at Harvard, who worked at the White House for a lot of different presidents, and he wrote books on organization at the White House. He described the job of the chief of staff as the care and feeding of the president, policy formulation, and marketing and selling. Care and feeding is by far the greatest responsibility that you don't know about. It's paying attention to the president 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to make sure the president is always in a good mood because you never know when tough decisions have to be made. So that really is paying attention to every minute of every day, 24 hours a day. Policy formulation is what you argue about all the time at the Kennedy School and everywhere else. And that's actually, I found, the easiest part of the job because the president attracts very, very bright people to be on the staff. And many of them are terrifically competent, and they are wise, and they have big egos. So the challenge for policy is more about managing the people that are participating in the policy rather than the policy itself. So the discipline there is around a process to make sure the president never gets bullied into a policy, that to the extent possible, you understand every consequence to the policy before you embrace it, so that there are fewer unintended consequences when the policy is put in place. And then finally, if the president makes a tough decision, and by the way, one of the biggest jobs for a chief of staff is to make sure the president never makes an easy decision. It's only the tough decisions. The president will have read great documents, met with very smart people, reached out to people who don't work at the White House to get a view from outside the White House, probably solicited support or understanding from people on Capitol Hill if there was a ramification there, and then maybe read about it, prayed about it, slept on it, talked with his spouse or her spouse about it, and then walks into the Oval Office bright and early in the morning and says, I made my decision. And he's done with it, or she's done with it. And so the chief of staff has the responsibility of telling people the president made a decision. That's marketing and selling. And it starts with the White House staff, the people that were involved in the policy, where the policy was developed without monolithic thinking, because if it's monolithic thinking, the president is not being well served. It's challenging thinking. And then you have to tell members of Congress, UN officials, presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, potentates, popes. That's the communications part of it. So that's the job, and you cannot do that job if there is not discipline around who sees the president when. And that's the gatekeeping aspect. It's really not about a gate that keeps information out. It's a gate that keeps people out who are distracting the president from the responsibilities that he might have.
Well, I think a lot of people know about the gatekeeper role. It's the role as the so-called honest broker that is so critical, right? Can you talk about that, Denis? Have the importance of that?
Yeah, well, if you think about exactly the point that Andy made, which is that you have a bunch of smart people, a bunch of committed people who have signed up to work for the president. And the beauty of it is that not only are they smart, but they have a lot of experience and they have a lot of confidence, to put it mildly. And so the challenge is making sure that any decision that comes to Andy, as Andy said, that comes to the president, comes to him square. That the decision's not coming to him in a series of different parts where he gets a bit of the information on Tuesday, but then he gets the rest of it on Thursday. The challenge, for precisely the reason that Andy said, which is the president's job is to decide things, but only to decide the hardest things. And if he's deciding the hard things, you want to make sure that it's as clean and clear a decision as possible. So the one person in the building who should be trying to protect the transparency of the process to develop the decision, the flow of information to inform the decision, and the participation of people in the debate around the decision is the chief. Because the chief is the one person who should then ensure that all that goes to the president in a square fashion. I've said this to you before, Chris, and to Andy, but when I met with the president about this job, I told him that, look, if you're looking for a good policy advisor for the job, somebody like Ram, that's not me. I'm not a domestic policy guy. But if you're looking for somebody who can ensure that the team stays together, that a decision comes to you transparently and squarely, and you make the decision and somebody doesn't come in the next day and say, well, wait a minute, why did you decide that? Did you know that I was against it? Right. And have the president have that be news? I told him that's the one thing I think the chief should do, and that's the one thing I think I could do.
Yeah. Mack, at the end of the day, the White House chief, among all the other things he does, has to be the person who executes the president's agenda, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because it's fine to develop policy. You certainly have to be, as both Denis and Andy spoke to, an honest broker in getting the information, but then you have to get it done. You have to get results. And the key, I think, to any successful presidency is the majority of the people in the country, whether they supported the president or not, feel like those policies are executed, implemented, and are affecting their lives and their futures in a positive manner. So I think that's absolutely crucial, and much of that execution, Chris, as Andy and Denis know so well, is at the cabinet and agency level. So you have to transmit that decision to the implementers of that, and of course you certainly have to bring along Congress in the process, or as our granddaughter would say, you'll be in big trouble if you don't.
So let's talk about how important it is to empower a White House chief to do just that. Donald Trump's first 6 months seems to me are proof that you cannot run the White House like a family real estate firm with advisors coming and going, no one empowered, and no chain of command. Jerry Ford tried something very similar to this back in 1974. He gave all his senior aides equal access to the Oval. He called this model the spokes of the wheel, with Ford at the center. It was a disaster. Within a month, he was begging Don Rumsfeld to step in and take over as White House chief and whip it into shape. So let me ask you, how important is it for the president to empower his chief as first among equals, and was it Donald Trump's failure to do so that doomed Reince Priebus? Anybody want to take that?
I'm the Republican in the room.
I think it might be the city, Andy, but
No, the reality is you do not apply to become the president's chief of staff. So it's not that the president goes to monster.com looking for candidates or anything like that. It doesn't happen that way. And the responsibility of a chief of staff is such that you have to have a kind of unique relationship with the president in order to be able to do your job. And you have to be empowered by the president to do the job. Yeah. If the president doesn't empower you as a chief of staff, someone else will think they're the chief of staff and function as the chief of staff. So it starts literally in the Oval Office. And if the president, and I think with Reince Priebus, the problem was Reince almost applied for the job. And I'm not sure that he was ever empowered to do the job. And a lot of other people had access to the president, and it was very hard to introduce discipline to the White House when the president wasn't practicing any discipline himself. And that created a situation, I think, where Reince was not able to bring discipline to the White House in any of the areas of responsibility, with the exception of the care and feeding. And I say this sincerely. President Trump has been well cared for as president. His luggage hasn't been lost. The plane is gassed and ready to go. The teleprompter works. Technically, the White House has been very well run, but the process of making policy and communicating the policy has not had the discipline to live up to the president's expectations. So I don't think that Reince Priebus was given the opportunity to be an effective chief of staff because he didn't get the president's backing, and too many people had access to the president. And it's not bad to give the president the ability to see people that he or she would want to see. It is bad to give access to people who want to see the president but don't need to. So I had the discipline of needs versus want when I was chief of staff. And I told all of the commissioned officers, and they're the ones with the fancy titles, assistant to the president, deputy assistant to the president, special assistant to the president. Those are commissioned officers. Those are people appointed by the president to serve. I would say to each one of them, anytime you need to see the president, you go see the president. I would like to know about it before, during, or after, but go see the president. You don't need my permission if it's a real need. Anytime you want to see the president, you better not go. Mm-hmm. And the discipline of needs versus want applies to people trying to see the president, to papers that people want to put on the president's desk, and to the emotional kind of give and take during a day, because someone may say, I know the president would really want to hear about this silly thing that happened because he likes that person or is intrigued by this, but the timing isn't right. And it takes the president off the cadence that is so necessary to meet the responsibilities that the chief of staff sees. So a chief of staff has to have the ability to recognize those with tunnel vision, have peripheral vision to understand the context of what needs to be done, and make sure that the work that the president is doing has the benefit of tunnel vision, but it's put in the context of what really needs to be done.
Chris, I would only add to what Andy said, and perhaps Dennis can talk about the empowerment and decision making, because I think Dennis did that in a particularly skilled manner. But I think any chief of staff, frankly, has to have the relationship and hopefully the front end understanding to, number one, the president views his chief of staff as an alter ego or a reality check. You know, what's really going on? What are you seeing? What's happening here? And secondly, you have to have the kind of relationship that you truly can offer constructive, respectful criticism to the president. You have to be able to do that in the right manner. The president has to feel comfortable that it's not going to be read about the next day in the paper. I don't think Reince Priebus ever had either of those two abilities with President Trump.
Well, speaking of telling presidents hard truths, I want to give Denis a chance in a second, but let's play one more clip that shows very dramatically, in a moment of crisis, a chief of staff telling a president what he does not want to hear. This is Andy Card on Air Force One with George W. Bush on the horrible morning of September 11, 2001. Let's play that.
We're flying in a serpentine way, waiting for fighter jets to come up and protect us. And the whole time, the president is telling me we're going back to Washington. The Secret Service is telling me we can't go back there until we know much more about what's happening. President Bush was adamant. He even used terms like, I am the President of the United States. And I was trying to be cool, calm, and objective. And I had the Secret Service very firm with me. I had the President of the United States very firm with me. And I just said, Mr. President, I really can't recommend that. We have to know more about the nature of the attacks and if others are coming. He was firm with me, and yes, he was yelling at me. He was yelling at me. And I just said, I really can't recommend that.
I think that clip pretty much speaks for itself, but
no, it's critical that the chief of staff have a brutally candid relationship with the president. It's also very important that relationship express its candor in private, without an audience.
Yeah.
But there were many, many times. I should back up a little bit. I had the privilege of working at the White House with President Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President George W. Bush. And people always want me to compare them and how they did their things. The truth is, I was in a different spot with each president. Ronald Reagan was like my grandfather. George H.W. Bush was like my dad, and George W. Bush was like my brother. When your grandfather says or does something stupid, you kind of ignore it. When your father says something stupid, you push back and then you feel really guilty. When your brother does something stupid, you say, "What were you thinking?" And President Bush and I had a relationship where we frequently challenged each other's thinking.
Andy, I want to give Denis a chance here. Denis, what about, can you give us tell us about your relationship with Barack Obama and whether you ever had to tell him some hard truths?
Well, I go back to the empowerment point for a second. I mean, there's two things I'd say about this. One is, every day in the White House you're doing the things that Andy said. And there's many components that are doing different things. Somebody needs to be calling the play, right? Yeah. And the problem is, when you call the play, everybody's got to run the play, including the president. Yeah. And you imagine if you're one of the players, I mean, it's not like the Red Sox where you get to see what the other team's plays are. But you want to, if you're another person on the team and Denis is calling the play, you have to have confidence that everybody's on side.
You've got to get the ball to the best shooter.
And the president's gonna run the play too. And I think that's what empowerment is. That when you say this is what we're doing, everybody's on side and they do it. Yeah. And the second thing is, the reason is that the most precious thing you have in that period is time. Right. We, Andy just said he's worked for a lot of presidents, but we all had the blessing to work for presidents who had 2 terms. But 2 terms go very fast, and no president gets to the end of 2 terms and says, you know what, I accomplished everything I wanted to do. No. Everybody always has something more they want to do, and by the way, the world intrudes. And so if you're wasting time running several different plays, you've sacrificed what the American people expect from the president, which is getting things done. The last thing I'll say is, when there's a tradition of the outgoing chief of staff having the incoming chief of staff come into the White House for lunch with the other chiefs of staff. So we did this in December with Reince. And the president stopped in and he said to Reince that, pointing at his chiefs of staff, President Obama's chiefs of staff who were assembled there, he said, every one of these guys made me really mad. And oftentimes, not all the time, he noted, oftentimes I realized when I was mad they were right. No, he didn't say every time they were right. He said that's what your job is, Reince, is to tell the president, even when it makes him mad, that he's wrong.
Yeah. Well, let's let's fast forward to the current occupants, General John Kelly. Just as I discovered in doing the book, The Gatekeepers, the Nixon White House was pretty bad, but it could have been even worse. That H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief, sometimes talked Nixon off the ledge. Nixon ordered him at one point to firebomb the Brookings Institution. Haldeman decided that wasn't such a great idea. On John Kelly's watch, the president has expressed solidarity with neo-Nazis. He has pardoned a sheriff who defied the law almost on a whim without respecting the pardon process. To what extent has John Kelly failed to tell the president hard truths?
I may know John best. I don't. But I worked very.
He's a Boston boy, though.
Yes, he is, and a good Marine. And I can guarantee you that one thing John Kelly does is speak clearly.
Yeah.
Having had several clear conversations with him. So he's got a very, very tough job, and he is as forthright and decent and patriotic a person as I've ever met. And I have every confidence that he's expressing those views very clearly.
At what point, if a chief of staff is expressing those views and not getting through to the president, should a chief of staff be prepared to resign? Should a chief of staff draw red lines and say, Mr. President, respectfully, if you cross this line, I will be compelled to leave? How do you deal with that?
Look, this is kind of fundamental question for everybody, irrespective of your assignment.
Yep.
And if you are in a position where you are supporting something that you can't in good conscience support, I think it's incumbent on you to resign. And I think any president would be surprised if you weren't. I think President Obama would be surprised if I weren't in a position to do that. The question at the end of the day is whether you're in a position of just disagreement. You're a staff person for the President of the United States. And he is the person elected by the people of this country to make the decisions he's making. And so that's a very high bar that one needs to get over. And the thing that you need in this job is some humility to recognize that you're, at the end of the day, a staff guy.
You're a staffer.
Yep.
And that's your job.
Yep.
And so, yeah, it's not that it's a position from which you should never resign. But boy, if you're going to resign, it's going to have to be over something that's a question of conscience.
Yeah, I think to just build on what Denis said, I totally agree. If you reach that point from a principle standpoint, moral standpoint, I just think you have to submit respectfully your resignation. On the other hand, you need to be very careful whether it's a policy disagreement or political disagreement versus a true moral disagreement. I think in the case of General Kelly, whom I do not know as well as Denis, but I think what you see, Chris, is kind of some realism of taking one strong step at a time, trying to get some order in the White House as well as order in the Oval Office. And I think in this case, with this president, unlike the people that we were privileged to serve, General Kelly will likely and already has enlisted the support of some of the other key people in the administration, particularly at the National Security Council and some of the cabinet members. And I think that's critical if he's going to ultimately be successful.
I give General Kelly very high marks for how he came into the responsibility of Chief of Staff. I do not know him well, but I do know him, and he does, or at least I found that he was not the least bit bashful about speaking truth to power and doing it quite effectively. And He's actually a remarkable leader because he has been a tactical leader on the field, but he was a strategic leader before people went to the field. So I think he's got the right mix, and I think he's already demonstrated the ability to bring more discipline to the White House that a lot of people thought this White House could find. And he still hasn't been there very long, so I think it's still a work in progress, but I'm optimistic, and I actually give President Trump credit for responding well to the Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. We don't know yet what's going to happen, but so far the responses have been surprisingly good, and I think General Kelly helped to play a role in making sure that the chain of command and the process has been disciplined enough to recognize the real responsibility, which is helping the victims. It's not the bureaucracy.
Let me ask you all another question that you've been eloquent about in print. And Mack, you wrote a piece recently about the difference between campaigning and governing. It's one thing to have a chief of staff who makes the trains run on time in the West Wing. It's another thing to get something done and advance your agenda. And this White House, I think it's fair to say, for 7 months has been broken, hasn't passed any major legislation, can't really even issue executive orders that are enforceable, can't get everybody on the same page. It seems to me that one thing that happens to presidents is they arrive in the Oval Office full of hubris, having won a campaign, and they think they can govern the way they campaigned. Do you think that's true, and do you think it's especially true of this president?
Well, I think it has been true, I think, particularly in the first year of a presidency. There's clearly takes an enormous amount of self-confidence to run for president, just to think you can win that position. Then you go through this extraordinary campaign at both President Bush 43 and certainly Senator Obama running from his place and winning his election, and Donald Trump's is even somewhat more surprising and remarkable in terms of the political process. So I think, Chris, you've got it right. You do have to quickly pivot from the campaign, where you can make general statements about issues, positions, but once you get to governing, you have specific legislation. And that's where I think President Trump is really having trouble. Of how do you translate when you're not the owner of your company saying this is how we're going to do it? That's not going to work with Congress, and that's where I think he's running into real problems. Certainly President Clinton understood that, having been a governor, but there is a transition, there's a learning curve, and you've got to get your agenda enacted at the end of the day. And I would certainly argue that good policy is generally good politics. And it certainly served President Clinton well in that first year, winning with 43% of the vote in 1992 with the third candidate, at the end of that first year being in much better shape politically because we had been able to enact the agenda and people felt it in their lives. To date, as you correctly point out, President Trump has not been able to do that.
Denis, you had a real challenge, and President Obama had a real challenge with the toxic partisanship. And I remember you telling me how Republicans would occasionally come to your office and say, "Just don't tell anybody I was here." Yeah. How do you govern these days?
Look, I think this is a big challenge for the country, and I think the both sides are firming up in the intensity of their positions, and what's compounding that is there's very little muscle memory in Congress on how things get done. Mm-hmm. And so, it used to be that, they spend a good part of the spring and summer writing individual appropriations bills that funded the government. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time since an individual appropriation bill was signed into law by the president. What they do now is they just bunch them all together, about 13 of them, into a big omnibus package or into a continuing resolution, as they call them, and they send it down to the White House. Right. And so what happens is they just forget how to do big, hard things. Yeah. And Andy's point about the president making hard decisions is that some of those are politically difficult decisions. It's not that, that gets to the president because everybody else could have easily resolved it, but they just decided to pass it up to the president.
Yeah.
If it's easy, it gets resolved by somebody else. Right. If it's getting to the president, it's going to be tough political sledding. And right now, I don't see an appetite I haven't seen an appetite in Congress for a long time in doing tough, big things.
Yeah. Well, the reality is, when I came to the Kennedy School, the rug of American politics had more rug than fringe. Mm-hmm. Today, the rug of American politics has more fringe than rug. And you can't get the right to stand on the rug without motivating the fringe, and we spend more time motivating fringe than we do on focusing on how to get things done while you're standing on the rug. And I think it's a challenge, and I think the digital communications, the social media that is out there makes it particularly challenging. So none of us are competent to talk about the answer because we weren't part of the solution in a world where a president tweets. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the most important responsibilities for a president is to taste his or her words before they spit them out. And the words that the president uses make a huge difference to other countries, to bureaucracies, to members of Congress, to the political community. So discipline around the words that are used really dictates much more than we teach even in our political science classes. So, and Donald Trump hasn't had a political science class anyway, and I don't think he learned the discipline of tasting his words before he spit them out or tweets them out, and I think that's been a challenge. Can I also add one other thing? Those of us who have served the president and get those fancy documents called a commission with you, United States of America, it's got your name, calligraphy, Massachusetts, your state, the job you have. It says you serve at the pleasure of the president for the time being. Mm-hmm. It's redundant in its insecurity. When the pleasure goes, you're gone. When the time being arrives, you're out the door. But the truth is, as soon as you accept that responsibility and take the oath, your job is not to work to please the president. You work to help the president do his job, and it may not be pleasurable. And that's what people have to learn.
One more question before we open it to this audience, and that is, Mack, you had let's return to moments of crisis. Early in Clinton's first term, you had a crisis very much like the one that Donald Trump faces with North Korea. And now we've got a president who is saber-rattling by tweet. What are the lessons, and how did you handle that crisis as chief?
Chris, you're right. We were faced relatively early on with the North Korean crisis with Kim Jong-il's father, who had a threat, not nuclear threat, but a threat of aggression against South Korea. And the 1992 campaign had been largely about the economy, James Carville's battle cry of the economy stupid, so there had not been the emphasis on foreign policy issues. And I think after the tragedy of 9/11, it's been a real shift of how the American public looks at foreign policy issues, safety and security, and that was not the case in our early years. What surprised me, Chris, the first thing we did was to try to analyze the situation. And we called in all of our experts from the CIA, the State Department, and so forth. And Denis and Andy, I was surprised at that point. This is not meant as a criticism, it's simply meant as a commentary, and it's been written about. The information was sparse on North Korea. And I was surprised, concerned, taken back, as was President Clinton, about just the lack of knowledge about the father, the governance, the situation. So we finally kind of worked through that, and the loss of life, if you have any kind of military action between North and South Korea, is horrific and almost instantaneously. Probably 250,000 people in the first wave. So it is a sobering moment. So we finally came up. I had the brilliant idea at the time President Carter, who had met the father to be our envoy to North Korea. And I had known President Carter. I'd worked with him when I was on the National Committee. I'd actually had an occasion when he was running for president to introduce him to law professor Bill Clinton in that particular era. And then Billy Graham, the renowned religious figure, had also had some interface. So that was a second point of reference. And then a third point of reference was Dwayne Andreas of Archer Daniels Midland. So these were three people that at least had been to North Korea and knew the ruling body there. So as I walked out of the Chief of Staff's office that morning, Denis and Andy, I thought, well, just another normal day. I get to call President Carter, Reverend Graham, and Dwayne Andreas here in the next hour. And of the three, I was the most uneasy about calling Billy Graham, let me quickly tell you, because of the promise he enjoyed. We did send President Carter to North Korea. That was our approach after we got a handle on the situation. He was effective in diffusing the situation. We were grateful for that. I must say, in fairness, he went a bit beyond his mandate, which Secretary Christopher, normally a mild-mannered Secretary of State, and Tony Lake and Sandy Berger at the National Security Council, which Denis will particularly appreciate, did not appreciate his going beyond his mandate. But we did resolve the crisis. But it's all hands on deck, and I don't think there's any question that the most sacred responsibility of any president, commander-in-chief, is the security and safety of the American people, and more broadly, the security and safety around the world. And that's what we faced, and Denis and Andy faced similar situations with different circumstances.
Chris, I'd say one thing about these crises early in administration, which I think is remarkable, and I think the Chief of Staff has a role to help facilitate, which is the President comes into office and immediately sits on top of a national security apparatus with which he may have some familiarity or may not have any, and surely does not have a close personal relationship with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for example, who serves in that job for a fixed period of time and could have been in the job appointed by a different president. I think historically you saw this, I think most poignantly in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where historians have commented that President Kennedy was struck that as he looked around the room, the person he was most familiar with was his Attorney General. Yeah. But the beauty of our system is that you have professionals who do these jobs over the life of their career. They become senior in their positions because they excel, and the president can fall right into the saddle, and at 12:01 on January 20th can turn to look to them and get the best, most candid advice, even knowing he doesn't have a personal relationship with them. Yeah. I think that's true right now with President Trump and General Dunford, for example, and it's one of the reasons that President Obama was eager to ask Secretary Gates to stay on after the Bush administration. Right. Developing that team feel with new bodies around the table is a particularly important responsibility, I think, for the Chief of Staff to help ensure that the President gets the relationships and the atmosphere that he needs to make tough decisions that have that kind of outcomes that we all fear in a situation like Korea.
Yeah. Well, on that comforting note, I could listen to you guys all night, but I think we need to take some questions from the audience, and we have a couple of microphones, one right here, the other right over here. If you would just give your name and a brief question, we will get started. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Todd Gillespie. I'm a visiting student from the University of Cambridge. I was just wondering if any of you would be willing to share some significant mistakes that any of you made that you learned from during your time.
Anybody?
What? I'm happy to start. You've charged in the breach a couple times.
No.
Go ahead.
Certainly I made many mistakes, and any mistake the president made should be attributed to me.
What's your mistake?
I'm serious about that. The one that weighs on me the most is actually quite personal. And that's that I was a strong advocate for Harriet Miers being seated on the Supreme Court. And I had done an awful lot of vetting for the president, a number of candidates to be on the Supreme Court. And there was a little committee, and I was very active in that. It actually starts even before the president takes office, because January 20th at noontime, they're the president, and should the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court justice die, there has to be an appointment made. So we started very early, and there was a process. And during that process, I would talk to lots of people, including Senator Ted Kennedy, for example, about who would you recommend be on the president's list. And I solicited from sitting members of the Supreme Court. And Harriet's name actually bubbled up through that process, to the surprise of some people in the White House. And I actually was an advocate for Harriet Miers to get the job. The president was very excited, and then he named her. And as you remember, she ended up withdrawing. And it was a painful process to me, because I was a party to it, an advocate, and I was the one that had to suggest to Harriet that it probably would be best if she did withdraw. And yes, that was a mistake. And it was a mistake, a little bit of arrogance, where the White House felt that the president could make that decision and we would introduce it. But the truth is, the work of the chief of staff is also to make sure the field is tilled and worked to accept the seed that will be planted. And I did not make sure that the right work was done outside of the White House to respond to the nomination of a Harriet Miers to be in the Supreme Court. So that's one. And it's kind of in the public domain. There were others that were not in the public domain, and I'm not going to talk about them.
I'll say that mine's simple. I started the job in February 2013. In the first meeting I had with the president, he said, we're going to have monthly meetings on implementation of the Affordable Care Act in preparation for the opening of the first open season for people to enroll in health insurance under the Affordable Care Act on October 1, 2013. We'll start with monthly, we'll go to bi-weekly, then we'll go to weekly meetings. We did that. I executed on that part. And he closed every meeting by saying, now everybody understands that this only works if the website works. We said, absolutely, Mr. President. But I still see in my mind's eye the kind of the scrolling website as of early October 2013. That was my feeling.
The walk you had to take to the Oval to tell him what had happened, right?
Yeah, and I walked down in early that first week of October 2013 to explain to him that the holdup on the website was not just because of so many people wanting health insurance, but in fact it was because there is a fundamental flaw in the design for the project.
Chris, I think 2 points, one mistake and one overall comment. I think it's an excellent question, because I think it underscores that despite the best of intentions, the best of preparation, the best minds, and some of the best minds in the country from all sectors, business, academia, government, there's still going to be mistakes. We're human beings. No one's going to get it right every time on every decision. I think in my case, Chris, we've talked about it before. In 1992, when Governor Clinton ran, the transition process was a very different process than it is now, and I think it's largely because of 9/11, where it was generally felt that if a president or candidate for president spent too much time on his transition in too formal a way, he was measuring the drapes. And I think had Governor Clinton done that, I think he would have been roundly criticized by the press, running against George H.W. Bush, a very distinguished president and a wonderful, wonderful person whom I greatly admire. So I think we got started very slow on the administration to put it in place. That was the way Governor Clinton saw it. I was late in terms of the selection of chief of staff. We spent enormous time on choosing the cabinet, which served us extremely well, particularly from an economic standpoint with Lloyd Benson, Leon Panetta, Ron Brown, others, Bob Rubin, among others. But we were slow to get our White House team in place. We did make course corrections pretty quickly with David Gergen here at Harvard and Lloyd Cutler in the White House counsel's job. But that was clearly a mistake that I think in subsequent years, and you talked about, Chris, your very successful, thoughtful, serious book, The Gatekeepers, the presidential transition process now has, as you know, Denis and Andy, funding from the government, and it's now understood that that is an essential part for either of the nominees for president. But that's I think, the one mistake.
Yes.
I'd say.
My name's Ben Bolger, and just a question. Members of Congress serve for 2 years. Senators serve for 6. There's probably no practical opportunity to change the length of service, but just as an academic question, is 4 years a good metric of time to serve? I recognize that both Bush and Clinton and Obama, of course, were fortunate to serve for 8 years. I was wondering if you could think, if you could redo it, is 4 or 8 years a good metric? And related to that, is the preparation of being either a senator, a governor, or vice president, of those 3, which do you think is the best preparation?
I think being a governor is the best preparation to be president of the United States, because a governor understands that leading means governing, because you have to bring along a cabinet and a legislative body and the people in order to get things done. So I would say governor is the best preparation to be a president. With regard to the terms, I think I would like to see 2 6-year terms, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. So I'm comfortable with 2 4-year terms. Or I would point out that Virginia produced an awful lot of presidents of the United States until they went to a 1-term governorship. And ever since they've had a 1-term governorship, they haven't had a president. So in Virginia, when you're elected governor, you're a lame duck on day 1. I think it's important for a president not to be a lame duck on day 1 of his first term or her first term. And so I would not favor going to a 1 6-year term, because I think that means the governor, as soon as the president gets in, someone else is angling to be president. That happens anyway, but at least make them work for it. So no, I don't think we should change the Constitution. I think it would be more painful, and there might be unintended consequences if you got that far down the road.
Yes.
My name's Andy Tisdale. I'm an interloper here. I'm a graduate student from Brandeis University. This is a sort of a question across eras. To what extent did you gentlemen exercise control over the media that your presidents consumed?
It's an easy answer.
Well, that was easy for me to add, because George Bush said he didn't read the newspaper, which was not the truth.
Of course.
He actually did consume the newspaper, but he starts with the sports page. His wife started with the front page. And she would tell him what was in the whole newspaper, not just on the sports page. I think if a chief of staff tried to limit the president's ability to get information, they would fail, and rightfully so. But I do think there should be discipline about how the president responds to the news. And I was blessed. Denis and Mack had the same blessing. What a privilege it is to go to work and then greet the president when they come to work and say, "Good morning, Mr. President." And it's something you do with optimism every day, no matter how bad the day is. Top of the morning, Mr. President, it's a great day, because you never want the president to have a bad day. So you greet him with optimism. And that was a great privilege. But I would then get into the news of the day, or the president would get into the news of the day, and I preferred that the president talk about the news of the day with the White House staff rather than with people outside of the White House, until he understood what the consequence of the news was to the team who was paid to pay attention. So that would be the discipline. I'm not sure that you say, don't let them see the newspaper today, or don't let them turn on the TV. I would not recommend that. I would recommend that all tweets go to the staff secretary before they go out.
Yeah,
Anybody else?
I think with President Clinton, we had kind of two kinds of press responses. One from a policy side, President Clinton actually liked to read other opinions about policy and to try to weigh that with whatever we were considering. So that was the positive side. On the political side, it was a different story. And while I did feel blessed, there were certainly days, I'm not sure I counted my blessings in the same way that Andy has just referred to. One morning I particularly remember a conservative radio talk show host who will go unnamed, but you can probably guess between the lines pretty quickly. President Clinton mentioned him in this particular gathering of various ministers from across the country, not once, not twice, but 3 times in this meeting. So he walked off, and I said, Mr. President, congratulations, ratings just went up 10 points. So you have to, I think that it has to be some measure of discipline there.
Yes, up here.
Hi, my name is Annie, and I'm an MPA here at the Kennedy School. Just wanted to thank you guys for joining us this evening. I have a 2-part question. First one is, for anyone sitting here in the audience that is thinking as an aspiring White House Chief of Staff or Chief of Staff role in any sort of capacity, what would you advise people think about as they're thinking about being in the support role versus being in the spotlight? And then my second question is, what's the best piece of advice that you've received or would like to provide through your experiences in terms of earning respect of those that you're managing? Thank you.
Well, the best piece of advice is you do what you say and you say what you do. And if you tell somebody you're going to do something, you do it. And if you tell them you're not going to do it, then you don't do it. And that, you know, in Washington, D.C., there's really no knockout punches. You know, people seem to keep getting back in the ring with you. And the circumstances change. And you're gonna run into people again. You know, Tom Donilon he said his mother used to tell him that you got to be careful, Tommy, when you're going up the elevator who you see, because you're going to be coming back down that elevator. And so I think we've lost a little bit of that in Washington. I don't think we've lost it in the country because communities, you know, neighbors, families, towns, cities, that's the way people operate. In Washington, it's different in that way. And, you know, I moved to Washington. I didn't even really know what the chief of staff was. And as Andy said, you don't really apply for the job. You end up getting told you're going to do it. And so I think the best advice about an inspiring chief of staff, other than, you know, being as forthright as you can about, you know, doing what you say and saying what you do, is read everything you can. This is why we would have never tried to control what President Obama read either. Yep. But the presidents have a skill that I think now, because of what we know about our media and what foreign intelligence services may do and otherwise, that your average consumer of media has to be more discerning. And one of the many blessings of working in this job was to see what a discerning thinker and reader President Obama was. And I think that's because of the proliferation of news sources and because of attempts by others to influence that news. It's incumbent on all of us now to be as discerning as these 3 presidents, or really adding the other President Bush and President Reagan, these 5 presidents were.
Yeah. I would only quickly add, keep your integrity and your humanity intact. And I think you need to have real security about your own self and your abilities, because you're chief of staff, regal, but as has been noted, it is chief of staff.
I would say, first of all, be involved in the political process. And to the extent that you have the courage, be involved in partisan political processes. So find someone you believe in or the philosophy that you believe in and get involved. I would not expect to be a chief of staff if you were apathetic. about how government works or how the process works. The second thing is read Jim Baker's biography. James A. Baker III, I think we'd agree, he was a remarkable chief of staff. And he served as a chief of staff with a troika, Baker, me, Stever, for older people, we remember those names. And then he was chief of staff all by himself. And then he was Secretary of State and came back as chief of staff. So if you want to find out the way to do it right, with James A. Baker III, I think would be at the top of the list. I would also say there are kind of two paths to being recognized for employment opportunities at the White House. One is to be a Condoleezza Rice, an academic who has become an expert and starts off as a very junior staffer in the National Security Council, gains reputation and recognition and gains the attention of a president, and then is selected because of her competence in policy, in debate, in temperament, and she was recognized and plucked to be a national security advisor, then Secretary of State. There are others like me who knocked on doors in Massachusetts and got involved in politics and ran for office and failed and ran for office and succeeded and went against the tide and demonstrated that I could argue the policy and stand up and defend it, and volunteered on a campaign and get to know someone who ends up becoming vice president. Then they become president. It helps to get in the door if somebody that holds the door, the key to the door, knows who you are. So those are the two paths that I would pick. I don't think there is any one template for how to be a chief of staff. I don't think Rahm Emanuel expected to be a chief of staff. Dennis, you didn't expect to be a chief of staff. Mack, you didn't expect to be a chief of staff. I didn't expect to be a chief of staff. I would say, finish with this. If you get involved in politics and you pretend you're the chief of staff, you never will be.
Let me just add to that there's a myth about the White House chief of staff that maybe to some extent I've perpetuated, which is that he has to be the president's son of a bitch. It's not. These guys are proof that that's not really true. What you have to be able to do is lead. You have to be able to inspire your staff. There's been a lot of talk about leaks in the Trump White House, and how do you minimize leaks? Do you strap everybody up to a polygraph? No. The way you minimize leaks, I think, is you tell the truth. You run a competent White House staff that inspires loyalty and not fear. And I think these guys are examples of White House chiefs who they used to say about Leon Panetta that he had an iron fist inside a velvet glove. Well, you have to be tough sometimes, but these guys are examples of how you can have humanity and you can be first-rate chiefs. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Suhail. I'm a second-year graduate student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. That's actually a great mind-reading trick. My exact question was about leaks from the White House and how you would propose dealing with a situation like that, and your thoughts on how the current administration has been dealing with that problem as well. Thank you.
You've heard my answer.
Well, I think it's a good. I think you had a good answer or a good observation there, Chris. And I think Denis recalls the phrase "no drama, Obama." I think what we tried to do, not totally successfully, was to kind of settle things down. And let's don't concentrate so much on what's going on in our important world in the White House. Let's concentrate on what we came here to do, and that's to serve the American people and look outward and get something done. So I think the more you can really focus people, believing they're part of something larger, believing they're supporting what they, in many cases, worked in the campaign for, prepared, as Andy and others have noted, for their career, then that in and of itself is going to kind of take the focus out of the gamesmanship of the leaks and up and down and all of that and the infighting. And we've seen that, really in a very unsettling, really unprecedented way in this White House, and that's an observation, not a political comment. But I think, you know, in our press, some of that's going to be inevitable, but you try to keep it in a way that is not harmful, destructive, corrosive to the president and what you're trying to achieve.
Supply and demand does an awful lot. There's a great supply of information inside the White House, and there's tremendous demand on the outside of the White House, so there's always pressure to get access to that supply. I think one way to mitigate the problem is to have good communications inside the White House, so people feel comfortable vetting their frustrations inside the White House rather than trying to take the debate outside and having someone else be perceived as a winner or a loser, when it should be the president who has the opportunity to make the decision and win. So that's an internal discipline, and I think we all tried to do that, is have better communications inside the White House. But it eventually comes down to respect for your colleagues. If you respect the burden of helping a president make brutally tough decisions, and you give people empowerment to offer their candid counsel to the president, you're going to have lots of different views, but chances are if you respect how those views are allowed to come out, you will respect the people who have the views and you won't leak about it to the press. But that beautiful siren called notoriety does cause people to say, I want to show how smart I am and what I know, and I'm going to tell somebody. And there's lots of people who are trained to be journalists but are really looking to get more eyeballs and ears.
See if we can get a couple more questions over here.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm a freshman at the college, and my question is kind of directed towards you, Mr. Card. Earlier, you mentioned about letting people have access to the president, needs versus want. So in that gatekeeping role, I was kind of wondering if you guys could talk about the way that you guys also had to screen information, making sure that like the game of telephone didn't happen as information got moved up the chain of command, and to like make sure that the president got what relatively the original information or views.
First of all, the White House structure itself, I think there's no definition that you need to have a chief of staff. There have been presidents, especially prior to Dwight David Eisenhower, that didn't have a chief of staff. I think it's the only bureaucracy in Washington that wasn't designed by Congress happens to be the White House bureaucracy. So it's the president who gives discipline to a chain of command. And I think it's up to the president to give that discipline. But once they give it, I would favor a chief of staff. Some have decided to use a troika or a duet or a quartet or a quintet or something. And I don't think it worked very well. I think giving the responsibility to a chief of staff, knowing that he is no better than anybody else, or she would be no better than anybody else, because they're all assistants to the president at that top level. Roughly 20 people have that title. And the chief of staff is an assistant to the president and chief of staff to the president. So, but it's, yes, someone has to be responsible, and it's really the discipline. It's not preventing people from getting access to the president. It's managing when the access provides the greatest value to the president. And that takes judgment. You get it wrong sometimes, but I think it's critically important to have discipline. But it's very hard to have discipline if the president, him or herself, is not disciplined and empowering the chief of staff. I had a wonderful relationship where the president and I said, I would like to know what you're doing. First of all, there wasn't a document to my knowledge that went to the president and didn't go to my desk first. So if he was getting a document, I would get to see it contemporaneous with him, or maybe even a little bit before him. And the same applied to tough decisions in the Oval Office. I think I was there for most of the tough decisions that the president made. But I also, at the end of the day, would talk to the president. And he was, President George W. Bush was very candid about explaining to me what happened during the day that I might not know about. So he would say, oh, you better go see Karl Rove. He dropped by, and I can't remember what he talked about, but why don't you go see him? Or they handed me this note. I haven't read it. I really want to. Can I read it? So it comes down to the discipline from the top, but I think you don't want to prevent the president from expanding his or her mind, and you want them to know what they need to know, when they need to know it to make tough decisions. And it's that discipline that the Chief of Staff has to invite on the President, because presidents are no different than the rest of us. They love to get the gossip, they love the rumors, they love to find the irrelevant thing that's kind of sexy. Mm-hmm. And you have to give them a little bit of that, because you're also worried about the care and feeding of the President, which means you want the President to be kind of enjoying the job. So you have to give them an opportunity to laugh and tell jokes and talk about somebody or raise a question. Who is he sleeping with now? I don't know. But those things happen, but it comes down to what Denis said. Time runs out. Time is your biggest enemy. And the world doesn't play on the same clock that we do. So the world doesn't cooperate with the time schedules that we would set. But we had to respect the reality that there were only 24 hours in a day and only X number of days in a term.
Can I say one thing about this? I associate with everything that Andy said. One thing that it seems apparent that John Kelly is trying to do in the last several weeks is strengthen and lift up the staff secretary. It seems it's a very important role. The staff secretary...
Robert Porter.
Yeah. The staff secretary at the end of the day is the person who makes sure that any piece of paper that's going to Andy's desk and then to the President's desk is fairly, transparently, cleanly handled among all the components of the White House. So that allows you to not really have to... I didn't really feel like I had to screen, as you said, because I knew that all of our colleagues felt that they had a fair shot at any piece of paper that's going to the President, because the staff secretary was empowered to make sure that that happened.
Over here.
My name is Charles Alemo. I'm a student here. Thank you, Harvard, for being alive and a leader. And I want to thank three of you who served under different presidents, under Democrats and under Republican. It's really an asset to have you guys out here, and thank you, Harvard, again for inviting them here. I have a question for three of you, which is going to be similar questions. I sometimes wonder how democracy works around the world. As America, the leader of the world, everything we do out here affects every part of the world. And I know we talked everything about U.S. Now I'm going to take you a little bit out of the U.S. to perhaps the third world country, Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa. And Andy, my question to you, first of all, I want to appreciate under President Bush, in 2005, I was in Oromia, the country currently called Ethiopia, when there was a bad situation in the country because of the election. Just in less than a minute, the U.S. Embassy came to our house and they grabbed a U.S. embassy, the U.S. citizen, took him out of to the airport and fly him over here. In 2015, when I went back to Ethiopia to see how my family are surviving, which I lost a genocide to this, which is still happening as I speak, I was arrested for 2 weeks and tortured out there by the Tigray government military, the minority that's ruling the country. Denis, my question to you is, how did democracy work, and why is it different from the Republican time? And my question to Chris is, under President Clinton, there was a genocide in Rwanda. Why? What is happening out there? And it was even quiet until it was over. And President Clinton went and apologized for what happened. Now the Oromo Nation are under a genocide, government-sponsored genocide. The minority Tigray ethnic group, the 5 million, are killing 100 million people. It has been ignored. I'm not surprised about our president.
Okay, there's a lot to deal with there.
And Myanmar, the kind of country that even Obama visited, what kind of advice did you, Denis, give to the president, as we see your jobs are very important in presidents?
Good. So, like a very important set of questions around the president's decision to travel to Ethiopia. It was very controversial at the time. I just associate myself with the defense of the trip that the president himself made, and that Susan Rice and that Josh Earnest, our spokesman, made at the time of the trip. I will say that one of the things that is unique about the chief of staff, in addition to the title, is that the chief is the one person who knows what's on the plate of everybody else around the table. Everybody else around the table is focused on their plate, but it's your job to know what's on their plate and what needs to go to the president. And this is why, as Andy said and Mack has said, it's so important for the chief to make a decision as to what's ready to go to the president when, and what can wait. Because there's never going to be a White House staffer who has an issue that he or she thinks can wait. It always needs to be resolved immediately. But as to your specific question about the Ethiopia trip, is obviously very controversial. And I think we've stated a defense of the decision to travel, and I stand by it.
In terms of democracy, I think the United States should be a beacon for democracy. And unfortunately, we have a democracy that most other democracies don't understand. And that's because ours is truly unique. We have separate but equal branches of government, so the Congress is not like a parliament. In most other democracies around the world, if the prime minister is in trouble, the parliament reacts and there could be a new election called. If a president is in trouble, we don't call a new election for Congress. So it's a different challenge because people schooled in democracy for most of the world are schooled in parliamentary forms of democracy, not our separate but equal three branches of government democracy, and I think that presents a challenge. But I just think the most important thing is the president can't solve every problem in the world. He can't even digest every problem in the world to begin to solve it. But it's important for the United States to be the beacon of hope, and I think that's the role of the president. Where we can't get engaged, because it may not rise to the level of national security interests that excludes some other national security concern, and those are the tough decisions the president makes. All of us have witnessed presidents in agony over what was happening someplace in the world, and they were not able to do something about it.
Let's see if we can take another. Yes.
Sorry, Mack.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Did you have a question?
I thought we were pointed upstairs. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and your service for the country. My name is Ryan Burke. I'm a student at the Kennedy School as well. It seems like it's really hard to stay a step above the president, ahead of the president every day. And we talked a little bit about time management, but I'm curious, in a job where you have to be saying hello in the morning and saying goodbye in the evening and then getting to work, what allowed you individually to stay in such demanding jobs for 4, 5, 6 years in some cases? And then also how you looked at what the president needs to see tomorrow versus a year from now.
My wife is here, right there. I guarantee that I wouldn't have even had the job if it hadn't been for my wife putting up with me for a long time. But no, it's a privilege to serve a president. If you get asked by a president to serve, you should try to find a way to say yes, unless you can talk him out of it. But it's a privilege to do it, and it should be a privilege. I'm someone who believes passionately that noble public service is what it's all about. And you here are all on path to be noble public servants. Okay. And it is a noble thing to serve. It's much better to serve in government making a difference than it is to go to Wall Street and make money. And so that's what drove me. The sanity of a wife who did not get excited about Klieg lights or election victories. She's a minister. So I viewed her as an insurance policy for what comes next. But having, all of us had to learn how to
manage time to also provide time for the people who loved us and that we needed.
Yeah.
And it is a great challenge. I didn't know how tired I was until I left the job.
Yeah. Dennis, what about you?
Well, I'd say the same thing. I've 3 terrific kids. I had an unbelievable wife, and there's just no way it would have happened without it. And the president's an understanding person too. And the question, your second question about what the president needs to see tomorrow and what he needs to see next week, next month, next year. I think this is why the training that Andy said that you guys are going through now is so important. You just have to be intentional. You have to make sure that you're carving out time in his agenda and time in your agenda to stop and not be overtaken by whatever the crisis of the day is, however monumental that crisis is. Ebola. I'll never forget sitting in the diplomatic room in the White House when we learned about the doctor who had come home from West Africa, and we had just learned he tested positive for Ebola after going bowling, riding the subway, and taking an Uber in New York City. And I thought to myself, this is like the worst movie I've ever seen. Obviously, it ends up working out very fine. But the challenge is setting aside any crisis so that you're preparing for carrying out the president's agenda and making sure that the team is ready for the next crisis that you don't see coming. And unless the chief is intentional about making that happen, it won't happen in the White House.
Yep. Chris, there's a great story about another chief of staff, Howard Baker, who was leader in the Senate, minority leader in the Senate when President Reagan called him to the White House. And he had told his wife, Joy Dirksen Baker, he emphatically would not ever consider doing that he was a national figure. The story goes, President Reagan said, Howard, I need you, I'm in trouble, but more importantly, the country needs you. And Howard Baker, in his great way, says, yes, sir, I'll be honored to serve. And the point is, in my case, when you had a lifelong friend, someone of a similar political ilk that was asking you to help him as he assumed the presidency, it's virtually impossible not to respond to that call to duty. It is a great privilege. It's demanding. You look at it as a once-in-a-lifetime period that you give everything you have to the job. And the challenges are enormous. You saw the complexity there on the earlier clips that were shown, but the rewards are equally enormous. The only other thing I would say, Chris, I came from a chief executive officer's job of a New York Stock Exchange company. And I'd been involved in the political process most of my adult life and even going back to college. But I would say one of the dynamics of a chief of staff's role and a president's role is the decision-making is much more accelerated in government than it is in the private sector. And you kind of think, well, government grinds slowly, bureaucracies and so forth, and that's true in the Congress, but not in the decision-making. If you listen to Erskine Bowles and Rahm Emanuel on that clip, these multiplicity of issues coming and the speed you have to make those decisions more accelerated, Dennis, under you than they were under Andy or me, are much faster than in any business setting, and oftentimes you don't have all the facts. So it really goes to your question of how you have to try to sequence your legislation, how you have to try to manage the president's time. I think we're fortunate to work for some extraordinarily gifted people as president, but that's one delineation I would make kind of in the context of your question.
Well, on that note, I think we've gone over time. It was worth it. I want to repeat what somebody else said, which is thank you, Harvard, for inviting these three amazing people to join us today.
And thanks, Chris, for writing a good book.
Thank you.
Good job. Fun. Good job, man.
Hey, thanks. Good job. Excellent.